We continue Timoleon from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. They found a good number of horses, every variety of engines, a multitude of darts, and weapons to arm 70,000 men, a magazine that had been formed from ancient time, besides 2,000 soldiers that were with him, whom he gave up with the rest for Timoleon's service. Dionysius himself, putting his treasure aboard, and taking a few friends, sailed away unobserved by Icates, and, being brought to the camp of Timoleon, there first appeared in the humble dress of a private person, and was shortly after sent to Corinth with a single ship and a small sum of money, born and educated in the most splendid court and the most absolute monarchy that ever was, which he held and kept up for the space of 10 years, succeeding his father's death. He had, after Dion's expectation, spent 12 other years in a continual agitation of wars and contests and great variety of fortune, during which time all the mischiefs he had committed in his former reign were more than repaid by the ills he himself then suffered, since he lived to see the deaths of his sons in the prime and vigor of their age, and the rape of his daughters in the flower of their virginity, and the wicked abuse of his sister and his wife, who, after being first exposed to all the lawless insults of the soldiery, was then murdered with her children and cast into the sea, the particulars of which are more exactly given in the life of Dion. Upon the news of his landing at Corinth, there was hardly a man in Greece who had not the curiosity to come and view the late formidable tyrant and say some words to him. Part rejoicing at his disasters, were led thither out of mere spite and hatred, that they might have the pleasure of trampling, as it were, on the ruins of his broken fortune, but others, letting their attention and their sympathy turn rather to the changes and revolutions of his life, could not but see in them a reproof of the strength and potency with which divine and unseen causes operate amidst the weakness of human and visible things. For neither art nor nature did in that age produce anything comparable to this work and wonder of fortune, which showed the very same man that was not long before supreme monarch of Sicily, loitering about perhaps in the fish market, or sitting in a perfumer's shop, drinking the diluted wine of taverns, or squabbling in the street with the common women, or pretending to instruct the singing women of the theatre, and seriously disputing with them about the measure and harmony of pieces of music that were performed there. Such behavior on his part was variously criticized. He was thought by many to act thus out of pure compliance with his own natural indolent and vicious inclinations, while finer judges were of the opinion that in all this he was playing a politic part, with a design to be contemned among them, and that the Corinthians might not feel any apprehension or suspicion of his being uneasy under his reverse of fortune, or solicitous to retrieve it, to avoid which danger he purposely, and against his true nature, affected an appearance of folly and want of spirit in his private life and amusements. However it be, there are sayings and repartees of his left still upon record, which seem to show that he not ignobly accommodated himself to his present circumstances, as may appear in part from the ingenuousness of the avowal he made on coming to Leucadia, which, as well as Syracuse, was a Corinthian colony, where he told the inhabitants that he found himself not unlike boys who had been in fault, who can talk cheerfully with their brothers, but are ashamed to see their father. So likewise, he said, could gladly reside with them in that island, whereas he felt a certain awe upon his mind, which made him averse to the sight of Corinth, that was a common mother to them both. The thing is further evident from the reply he once made to a stranger in Corinth, who, deriding him in a rude and scornful manner about the conferences he used to have with philosophers, whose company had been one of his pleasures, while yet a monarch, and demanding, in fine, what he was the better now for all those wise and learned discourses Plato. Do you think, said he, I've made no profit of his philosophy, when he see me bear my change a fortune as I do, and when Aristoxenus, or is it Aristoxenus, the musician, and several others desired to know how Plato offended him, and what had been the ground of his displeasure with him, he made answer that of the many evils attaching to the condition of sovereignty, the one greatest infelicity was that none of those who were accounted friends would venture to speak freely, or tell the plain truth, and that by means of such he had been deprived of Plato's kindness. At another time, when one of those pleasant companions that are desirous to pass for wits in mockery to Dionysius, as if he were still the tyrant, shook out the folds of his cloak as he was entering into a room where he was, to show there was no concealed weapons about him. Dionysius, by way of retort, observed that he would prefer he would do so on leaving the room, as a security that he was carrying nothing off with him. And when Philip of Macedon, at a drinking party, began to speak in banter about the verses and tragedies which his father, Dionysius the elder, had left behind him, and pretended to wonder how he could get any time from his other business to compose such elaborate and ingenious pieces, he replied, very much to the purpose. It was at those leisurable hours which such as you and I and those we call happy men bestow upon our cups. Plato had not the opportunity to see Dionysius at Corinth, being already dead before he came thither, but Diogenes of Sinope, at their first meeting in the street there, saluted him with the ambiguous expression, O Dionysius, how little you observe your present life. Upon which Dionysius stopped and replied, I thank you, Diogenes, for your condolence. Condole with you? Replied Diogenes. Do you not suppose that, on the contrary, I'm indignant that such a slave as you, who, if you had your due, should have been let alone grow old and die in the state of tyranny, as your father did before you, should now enjoy the ease of private persons, and be here to sport and frolic in our society, so that when I compare those sad stories of Philistus touching the daughters of Leptines, where he makes pitiful moan on their behalf, as fallen from all blessings and advantages of powerful greatness to the miseries of an humble life. Well, you can have a humble life and have power and wealth and all sorts of good things, right? They seem to me like the lamentations of a woman who has lost her box of ointment, her purple dresses, and her golden trinkets. Such anecdotes will not, I conceive, be thought either foreign to my purpose of writing lives, or unprofitable in themselves by such readers as are not in much haste, are busied and taken up with other concerns. But if the misfortune of Dionysius appears strange and extraordinary, we shall have no less reason to wonder at the good fortune of Timoleon, who, within 50 days after his landing at Sicily, both recovered the citadel of Syracuse and sent Dionysius, an exile, to Peloponnesus. This lucky beginning so animated the Corinthians that they ordered him a supply of 2,000 foot and 200 horse, who reaching Three intended to cross over thence into Sicily, but finding the whole sea beset with Carthaginian ships, which made their passage impracticable, they were constrained to stop there and watch their opportunity, which time, however, was employed in a noble action, for the Thurians, going out to war against their Brutian enemies, left their city in charge with these Corinthian strangers, who defended it as carefully as if it had been their own country, and faithfully resigned it up again. Hicetas in the interim continued still to besiege the castle of Syracuse, and hindered all provisions from coming in by sea to relieve the Corinthians that were in it. He had engaged also and dispatched towards Adranum 2 unknown foreigners to assassinate Timoleon, who at no time kept any standing guard about his person, and was then altogether secure, diverting himself without any apprehension among the citizens of the place, it being a festival in honor of what they consider to be gods and goddesses. Now, most of these are timed by seasons, right? Or maybe not seasonal, but they're tied to a calendar. But, there can be ones that are, well, sometimes an astronomical alignment produces a astrological myth, which, produces a myth. But sometimes you have something else that people say, okay, we need a festivity. The two men that were sent, having casually heard that Timoleon was about to sacrifice, came directly into the temple with the poniards under their cloaks, and pressing in among the crowd, by little and little got up close to the altar. But as they were just looking for a sign from each other to begin the attempt, a third person struck one of them over the head with a sword, upon whose sudden fall neither he that gave the blow, nor the partisan of him that received it, kept their stations any longer, but the one making way with his bloody sword put no stop to his flight, till he gained the top of a certain lofty precipice, while the other, laying hold of the altar, besought Timoleon to spare his life, and he would reveal to him the whole conspiracy. His pardon being granted, he confessed that both himself and his dead companion were sent thither purposely to slay him. While this discovery was made, he that killed the other conspirator had been fetched down from his sanctuary of the rock, loudly and often protesting as he came along that there was no injustice in the fact, as he had only taken righteous vengeance for his father's blood, whom this man had murdered before in the city of Leontini, the truth of which was attested by several there present, who could not choose but wonder too at the strange dexterity of Fortune's operations, the facility with which she makes one event the spring and motion to something wholly different, uniting every scattered accident and loose particular and remote action, and interweaving them together to serve her purpose, so that things that in themselves seem to have no connection or interdependence whatsoever became in her hands, so to say, the end and beginning of each other. Now, one's ritual life should definitely incorporate that aspect of, responding to things that finding the connections and all that. Not necessarily the twisting the truth and stuff like that's implied with her, but the The Corinthians, satisfied as to the innocence of this seasonable feat, honored and rewarded the author with a present of £10 in their money, since he had, as it were, lent the use of his just resentment to the tutelar genius that seemed to be protecting Timoleon, and had not pre-expended this anger, so long ago conceived, but had reserved and deferred under fortune's guidance for his preservation, the revenge of a private quarrel. But this fortunate escape had effects and consequences beyond the present, as it inspired the highest hopes and future expectations of Timoleon, making people reverence and protect him as a sacred person sent by heaven to revenge and redeem Sicily. Hecates, having missed his aim in this enterprise, perceiving also that many went off and sided with Timoleon, began to chide himself for his foolish modesty, that when so considerable a force of the Carthaginians lay ready to be commanded by him, he had employed them hitherto by degrees and in small numbers, introducing the reinforcements by stealth and clandestinely, as if he had been ashamed of the action. Therefore, now laying aside his former nicety, he calls in Mago, their admiral of his whole navy, who presently set sail and seized upon the port with a formidable fleet of at least 150 vessels, landing there 60,000 foot, which were all lodged within the city of Syracuse, so that in all men's opinion the time anciently talked of and long expected, wherein Sicily should be subjected by barbarians, was now come to its fatal period, for in all their preceding wars and many desperate conflicts with Sicily, the Carthaginians had never been able, before this, to take Syracuse, whereas Hecates, now receiving them and putting them into their hands, you might see it become now, as it were, a camp of barbarians. By this means, the Corinthian soldiers that kept the castle found themselves brought in great danger and hardship, as besides that the provision grew scarce, and they began to be in want, because the havens were strictly guarded and blocked up. The enemy exercised them still with skirmishes and combats about their walls, and they were not only obliged to be continually in arms, but to divide and prepare themselves for assaults and encounters of every kind, and repel every variety of the means of offense employed by a besieging army. Timoleon made shift to relieve them in these straits, sending corn, kernels. They did not what we call corn. From Catana by small fishing boats and little skiffs, which calmly gained a passage through the Carthaginian galleys in times of storm, stealing up when the blockading ships were driven apart and dispersed by the stress of weather, which Mago and Hecates observing, they agreed to fall upon Catana, from whence these supplies were brought in to the besieged, and accordingly put off from Syracuse, taking with them the best soldiers in their whole army. Upon this, Leon the Corinthian, who was the captain of those that kept the citadel, taking notice that the enemies who stayed there behind were very negligent and careless in keeping guard, made a sudden sally upon them as they lay scattered, and killing some and putting others to flight, he took and possessed himself of that quarter which they call Acradina, and was thought to be the strongest and most impregnable part of Syracuse, a city made up and compacted as it were of several towns put together. Having thus stored himself with corn and money, he did not abandon the place, nor retire again into the city, but fortifying the precincts of Acradina, and joining it by works to the citadel, he undertook the defense of both. Mago and Icates were now come near to Catana, when a horseman dispatched from Syracuse brought them tidings that Acradina was taken, upon which they returned in all haste, with great disorder and confusion. Having neither been able to reduce the city they went against, nor to preserve that they were masters of. Now, buckwheat is, I guess, a possibility, but wheat and rye and barley were probably more likely to be. These successes, indeed, were such as might leave foresight and courage a pretence still of disputing it with fortune, which contributed most to the result, but the next following event can scarcely be ascribed to anything but pure felicity. The Corinthian soldiers who stayed at Thurile, partly for fear of the Carthaginian galleys, which lay in wait for them under the command of Hanno, and partly because the tempestuous weather, which had lasted for many days, had rendered the sea dangerous, took a resolution to march by land over the Bruttian territories, and what with persuasion and force together made good their passage through those barbarians to the city of Rhegium, the sea being still rough and raging as before. But Hanno, not expecting the Corinthians would venture out, and supposing it would be useless to wait there any longer, bethought himself, as he imagined, of a most ingenious and clever stratagem, apt to delude and ensnare the enemy, in pursuance of which he commanded the seamen to crown themselves with garlands, and adorning his galleys with bucklers, both of the Greek and Carthaginian make, he sailed away for Syracuse in this triumphant equipage, and using all his oars as he passed under the castle with much shouting and laughter, cried out on purpose to dishearten the besieged that he was come from vanquishing and taking the Corinthian succors, which he fell upon at sea, as they were passing over into Sicily. While he was thus trifling and playing his tricks before Syracuse, the Corinthians now come as far as Rhegium, observing the coast clear, and that the wind was laid, as it were by miracle, to afford them in all appearance a quiet and smooth passage, went immediately aboard on such little barks and fishing boats as were then at hand, and got over to Sicily with such complete safety and in such an extraordinary claim that they drew their horses by the reins, swimming along by them as the vessels went across. Well, certainly. Oh, the horses swam with them. Okay, then they literally could have grabbed logs and planks and stuff and paddled, right? When they were all landed, Timoleon came to receive them, and by their means at once obtained possession of Messena, from whence he marched in good order to Syracuse, trusting more to his late prosperous achievements than his late prosperous achievements than his present strength, as the whole army he had then with him did not exceed the number of 4,000. Mago, however, was troubled and fearful at the first notice of his coming, and grew more apprehensive and jealous still upon the following occasion. The marshes about Syracuse, that receive a great deal of fresh water, as well from springs as from lakes and rivers discharging themselves into the sea, breed abundance of eels, which may be always taken there in great quantities by any that will fish for them. The mercenary soldiers that served on both sides were wont to follow the sport together at their vacant hours, and upon any cessation of arms, who, being all Greeks, and having no cause of private enmity to each other, as they would venture bravely in fight, so in times of truce used to meet and converse amicably together. And at this present time, while engaged about this common business of fishing, they fell into talk together, and some expressing their admiration of the neighboring sea, and others telling how much they were taken with the convenience and commodiousness of the buildings and public works. One of the Corinthian party took occasion to demand of the others, "And is it possible that you, who are Grecians born, should be so forward to reduce a city of this greatness and enjoying so many rare advantages into the state of barbarism, and lend your assistance to plant Carthaginians that are the worst and bloodiest of men, so much the nearer to us, whereas you should rather wish there were many more Sicilies to lie between them and Greece? Had you so little sense to believe that they come hither with an army from the Pillars of Hercules and the Atlantic Sea to hazard themselves for the establishment of Hicetas, who, if he had the consideration, would become a general, would never have thrown out his ancestors and founders to bring in the enemies of his country in the room of them, when he might have enjoyed all suitable honor and command with consent of Timoleon. And the rest of Corinth, the Greeks that were in pay with Hicetas, noising these discourses about their camp, gave Mago some ground to suspect, as indeed he had long sought for a pretence to be gone, that there was treachery contrived against him, so that although Hicetas entreated him to tarry, and made it appear how much stronger they were than the enemy, yet conceiving they came far more short of Timoleon in respect of courage and fortune, then they surpassed him in number, and presently went aboard and set sail for Africa, letting Sicily escape out of his hands with dishonor to himself, and for such uncertain causes that no human reason could give an account of his departure. The day after he went away, Timoleon came up before the city in array for a battle. But when he and his company heard of this sudden flight, and saw the docks all empty, they could not forbear laughing at the cowardice of Mago, and in mockery caused proclamation to be made through the city that a reward would be given to any one who could bring them tidings, whether the Carthaginian fleet had conveyed itself from them. However, Hicetas, resolving to fight it out alone, and not quitting his hold of the city, but sticking close to the quarters he was in possession of, places that were well fortified and not easy to be attacked, Timoleon divided his forces into 3 parts, and found himself upon the side where the river Anapas ran, which was most strong and difficult of access, and he commanded those that were led by Isias, a Corinthian captain, to make their assault from the post of Acradina, while Dinarchus and Dabaratus, that brought him the last supply from Corinth, were with the 3rd division to attempt the quarter called Epipola, a considerable impression being made from every side at once. The soldiers of Hicetas were beaten off and put to flight, and this, that the city came to be taken by storm and fall suddenly into their hands upon the defeat and rout of the enemy, we must in all justice ascribe to the valor of the assailants and the wise conduct of their general, but that not so much as a man of the Corinthians was either slain or wounded in the action. This, the good fortune of Timoleon seems to challenge for her own work, as though in a sort of rivalry with his own personal exertions. She made it her aim to exceed and obscure his actions by her favors, that those who heard him commended for his noble deeds might rather admire the happiness than the merit of them. For the fame of what was done not only passed through all Sicily and filled Italy with wonder, but even Greece itself, after a few days, came to ring with the greatness of his exploit, insomuch that those of Corinth, who had as yet no certainty that their auxiliaries were landed on the island, had tidings brought them at the same time that they were safe and were conquerors. In so prosperous a course did affairs run, and such was the speed and celerity of execution with which fortune, as a new ornament, set off the native lustres of the performance. Now, it's not just whether you conquer; it's it's how you conquer, or for what reason you're conquering, right? Uh, Timoleon, being master of the citadel, avoided the error which Dion had been guilty of. He spared not the place for the beauty and sumptuousness of its fabric, and keeping clear of the suspicions which occasioned first the unpopularity and afterwards the fall of Dion, made a public crier to give notice that all the Circassians who were willing to have a hand in the work to bring pickaxes and mattocks and other instruments, and help him to demolish the fortifications of the tyrants. When they all came up with one accord, looking upon that order and that day as the surest foundation of their liberty, they not only pulled down the castle, but overturned the palaces and monuments adjoining, and whatever else might preserve any memory of future tyrants. And yeah, you don't let, if it's the right thing to do, beauty and luxury or whatnot of what you're against, shouldn't stand in the way. There is importance in preserving cultural things, though. Having soon leveled and cleared the place, he there presently erected courts for administration of justice, ratifying the citizens by this means, and building popular government on the fall and ruin of tyranny. But since he had recovered a city destitute of inhabitants, some of them dead in civil wars and insurrections, and others being fled to escape tyrants, so that through solitude and want of people, the great marketplace of Syracuse was overgrown with such quantity of rank herbage that it became a pasture for their horses, the grooms lying along in the grass as they fed them, while the other towns, very few excepted, were become so full of stags and wild boars, so that those who had nothing else to do went frequently a-hunting, and found game in the suburbs and about the walls, and not one of those who possessed themselves of cattle or made garrisons in the country could be persuaded to quit that present abode, or would accept an invitation to return back into the city, so much did they all dread and abhor the very name of assemblies.